Excellent. Welcome to this presentation on AI interactions with sports data. I'm Michael Shuckers here today with Cris Ippolite. And Cris and I are going to record a sort of more informal, long version of a talk we gave this past weekend at the Midwest Sports Analytics meeting. So want to get started by thinking about fantasy football. And when Cris and I started working back in the early 2010s, the problem with fantasy football was how to adjust for strength of schedule. And so, not a whole lot of machine learning, not a whole lot of thinking analytically about what was going on there. And so Cris and I got together and we built this model for predicting fantasy points. For those of you, from back in the day that were playing fantasy football, we've got some of the top players from that season on there. And also there's a mention of the paper that we presented in 2013 at a sports analytics conference. So the original model that we did and we published in 2013 and that we have been updating ever since really has two components. So we have a player model, which is, the model has a target of fantasy points, right? And the features that are part of it are the players that are the player involved, right? Because we're interested in the fantasy points for that player. What position do they play? What team are they on? Who's their opponent? Other things about how the game went. And in particular, one of the things that we do is we think about their targets above what their averages have been. In the opponent's model, we wanted to account for teams and defenses in particular. So this is really thinking about the opponent of the player that you're thinking about. And we wanted to really build that model with the idea of how many points they were conceding, not per player, but in total. And so we built that model to account for that. And then what that does when we put these two things together is that we get a player rating for each week, right? So we have a player and we have their value, right? What we see is their prediction, but then also we adjust that for who they are going up against each week. And, to toot our own horn here, we did very, very well, right? So, something over the past dozen years or so, right? Very regularly in the top 5, top 10 most accurate fantasy football sites and predictions. But one of the issues that we had with what we were doing is that people still had trouble and still wanted to know, oh, should I trade Drew Brees for Adrian Peterson? Or, those sorts of questions that we have on a sort of week-to-week basis. And so one of the things that we tried to do is we tried to move to a sort of a Madden ratings model, right? This is fantasy football. Lots of these folks understand and are more used to thinking in terms of a Madden style. So we did a little rescaling of our predictions. Again, it's a different scale and a different rescaling for each position. And we tried to sort of match the historical mean of the top players at each position to about 70. And then we would have some ratings relative to that. So here are the ratings of that converted Madden for Travis Kelce, right? We can see there Travis has a player rating of 84, right? So Travis is still one of the top tight ends in fantasy football. And so that's his individual rating. He's got not a great matchup this week. And so his weekly rating is down a little bit from that. But we can look at the rest of schedule rating. So that's that 87 there and say, Travis is maybe somebody you want to trade for because his rating is going to be higher because of easier opponents on average going forward. And again, here is a typical thing from the FantasyoMatic site. This is just looking at our ratings for running backs. And so you have the individual player rating there in the second column. So players in the first, player rating in the second. You've got the matchup adjustment. So what does that look like in terms of who they're playing this week? And then that combine those two, that gives you your rating for the week. So what do we expect them to do? What do we predict that they're going to do in terms of performance on this given week? And in this case, week 10.
And this, of course, is how we display it on the FantasyoMatic website. When we focus grouped the ratings originally, as Michael indicated, back before we did the 0 to 100 Madden style, we were doing just a classic ratings, and they were numbers that didn't really make much sense to our users. So through the focus groups, we found that the 0 to 100 made a lot more sense, and we presented this in the website in the kind of conventional manner that you see ranks and lists, and you can kind of sort by the different positions, and it's kind of the same type of thing that you see all over various different websites. Then something really interesting started to happen, or I guess I should say didn't stop happening. And that was text messages. This is pretty much what my Sunday morning looks like. Even though I had a website out there for years, and even though everybody knows where to find it, still all my friends and family would text me questions, and in just kind of this vernacular here, just what are the names of the person, not even the full names, just who do I start? Yeah. I know you have a website, but can you just tell me which of these 2 guys or 3 guys should I be starting? And really, it occurred to me at some point that this is how people want to interact with data. No matter how great your machine learning model is, no matter how great the predictive analytics are, if it's not approachable enough for consumers in this case, or just end users to be able to actually interact with, then how useful is it? So the light bulb kind of went off, and we thought, hey, maybe the way to really make this information as approachable as possible is to use a conversational AI approach. And of course, this has been made popular in recent years by ChatGPT. In November of, actually, it was probably around the end of November, beginning of December in 2022, ChatGPT was released. So this introduced the entire world, hundreds of millions of people, to the idea of conversational AI that maybe weren't familiar with it before. Now, of course, it introduced a way to chat with information, but it was chatting with its own information. And that's where our light bulb went off, and we said, hey, what about if we have users just chat with our information? So it doesn't really matter what the ratings are. It can tell them what the ratings are and explain this as it goes, or tell the users which of the 2 players they should actually choose. This way, they can have a conversation with it in the same way that all those text messages come in. This guy or this guy, just tell me what I should do. So right before we started to build out an entire conversational UI interface for the entire website, we were actually getting pretty aggressive with it. We were going to scrap the entire lists and sorting website that we currently have now and replace it just with a conversation bot. So before we did that, actually, I wish it was a little sooner than that, because we got a little bit further into the process than I would have hoped. But all of a sudden, in March of 2023, ChatGPT plugins were announced. So this meant that you could now use the ChatGPT paradigm to be able to use this conversational AI. So you didn't have to build your own. So that's great. So we didn't have to rebuild that. But you could now reroute, instead of to their information, you could reroute it to your own knowledge base. And this is what that experience looks like. So here's actually how you might ask one of those text message questions that I just showed you a couple slides ago, but in this conversational AI format. So let's take a look. So first, you're going to click on plugins. You'll load the FantasyoMatic plugin. If you have ChatGPT Plus, you can go and try this out on your own. And then you just simply type in the question. I literally copied and pasted that same text message into this, and we'll see what it does. So now you can see it's got some formatting. That's part of the instruction that we gave it. It's got all of our player ratings in there. You notice that all the truth is coming from our machine learning model outputs, not from something that's inside ChatGPT. This is probably something that a lot of people don't know is possible. And at the same time, we can still click over to our website if we want to. So all of that instruction, the way that it's displayed, the fact that it goes and looks into our model outputs for the truth, all of that is coming from our knowledge base. None of this is coming from the ChatGPT, or in this case, the GPT 3.5 model. So that is the really, really important part of this. You'll notice also at the bottom that all the analysis and recommendation, that's really where the power of the LLM comes into play. So how is this working? Well, just this whole concept here is based on something that's called retrieval, or is popularly referred to as retrieval augmented generation. That the abbreviation for that, or the acronym, is RAG. And really what the principle here is, and this is very important, is when a user asks a question, the question doesn't go right over to the language model. Instead, the question goes to the knowledge base. In our case, it is a query where we are querying our outputs of our model. So every week we update the FantasyoMatic model, therefore it's got new outputs. So when somebody says, who do I start, this quarterback or this quarterback, we're not pinging the language model, we're pinging our data source. And in our case, our data source is actually driven by our proprietary machine learning model. Then the relevant knowledge comes back. The relevant knowledge, which would be the answer, It's the information of here's the player ratings and the weekly ratings and the rest of season ratings. All of that information, along with the original question, is then sent to the language model. And then it responds with the formatting based on the instruction that we gave it and the actual answer, and it gives it its own analysis. So the language model still plays a really important role, but all of the truth is actually coming directly from us, both from our instruction and from our knowledge base. This is a really important part about how all this works. So that's really how you can reroute your own knowledge or your own truth into a ChatGPT experience. And again, we're just talking about ChatGPT here in this discussion. There, of course, are other ways that you can build these things out custom and integrate them with your own system, which we'll talk briefly about at the end. But then something really interesting came out just about 2 weeks before we were recording this. We had the plugin, and then OpenAI announced something that's called GPTs. And GPTs are another ChatGPT experience, but now you can build in your instruction and the connection to your, in our case, API source. So really, we were able to then replicate the ChatGPT experience inside of a GPT. Well, what's the point of that? Well, we could also then leverage some of the other tools that ChatGPT plus users have access to. Most importantly, that would be Code Interpreter. And Code Interpreter means that we now have not only all the information from our knowledge base, which is our machine learning model outputs, but now we can leverage an entire Python environment, all the different packages for visualization and analysis, and all of that can be combined together with our own data, which I'm going to show you here right now. So that Code Interpreter experience, leveraged with the conversational UI experience from ChatGPT and with our proprietary machine learning data, gave a whole new experience for interacting with our FantasyoMatic outputs. So for example, let me show you. So this is inside the FantasyoMatic GPT, which we will talk about a little bit later and also provide links to in the description of this video. But let's see how this works. So here, I'm actually saying list all the wide receivers with the 5 highest player ratings. So this is information about that, from our machine learning model. So now it just queried our model and it came back with the top 5 players. And now I'm saying, give us a JSON formatted list of these 5 players of all the games they've played so far this season. So now you see that we're getting the fantasy points on one column and our FantasyoMatic proprietary weekly rating in another. Notice here that it identified that one of the users did not have complete information, so they're dropping them from the analysis, and that's because he was injured for several weeks. And now I said, in this data, use Code Interpreter. And so everything that you're seeing in this window that's popping up here is all Python that's being generated automatically. So the role that the language model is playing here is actually going and finding the right packages and running all this in this execution environment, even creating a data frame with the data that we supplied to it. And here it came back with all the appropriate coefficients, suggesting a correlation between fantasy points and the player rating or the weekly rating that we fed to it. And now just a second ago, what you saw is now I'm adding entirely different data that's not part of the FantasyoMatic machine learning model. This really shows how you can use Code Interpreter or an execution environment combined with your knowledge to allow users to be able to do analysis that you didn't even think of. So all these different correlations that I'm feeding to it were not something that we included into our model, but now we're allowing in this user experience the ability to leverage our model and our outputs of our model with an entire execution environment. So here you see it's analyzing all the different new potential correlating values that I just fed to it. And it came back with the analysis and told us, oh yeah, here are some interesting things that you can do with it. And you might notice there a second ago, I said, well, can you explain this to somebody who's not a data scientist? Because the other thing that language models do a really good job of is explain difficult concepts in a very simple way. So now we're actually going to say, can you use Code Interpreter to load some of these packages to give us some visualization? So now you see we have a correlation of the various factors and points scored. So it's a really cool, easy to understand bar chart, and a description of the visualization is more. And of course, I just went and said, hey, how about a couple more of those visualizations? Everybody likes looking at these. So here we have now a heat map correlation with the different factors, and we'll have one more, which is a scatter plot. And now you see the descriptions of both the heat map and the scatter plots that are being all provided as part of the description. So again, what we're doing here is we're leveraging proprietary data with an execution environment to be able to come up with a way that any user can interact with data, no matter how sophisticated their needs are. Now what it's actually doing is helping me step by step go and create my own notebook. So let's say I wanted to take this this interesting interaction that I'm having and go move it into Colab or something. That was the steps necessary to do so. And Code Interpreter even has the way to be able to analyze the data, both the data that I supply to it and the data coming from our model, and come up with various different models of its own. So here's it was a list of suggestions. And then also now you're actually seeing what it's doing is allowing me to combine all those together into a downloaded file, sort of a report that I can take with me and share with other users if I want to. So the idea here is a combination of proprietary data, language models, and an execution environment and endless amounts of packages and libraries available to you to do whatever kind of dynamic investigations that you want to inside of your proprietary data. So real quick note that we'll provide the links in this video description, but this is actually the GPT, a link to the GPT. So any ChatGPT Plus users can go here. If you don't have ChatGPT Plus, you can sign up for it. This, of course, is just inside of a GPT. We build these out for our clients as custom interactions, but this is an easy way to deliver it to users. And Michael mentioned a paper from 2023 that we had generated for a different conference, which was now 10 years ago. And we decided we would create a GPT for that paper as well. So you can just go and ask questions of the paper, maybe throw some of your own data at it, challenge some of our hypotheses, or do whatever you want. You can fully engage with this paper using the same GPT concept. So really what we wanted to do here is really talk to you, show people an example using sports data in kind of a fun consumer kind of product way using fantasy football data. But Michael, this of course is not only applicable to sports data. We work with a lot of businesses. A couple examples of some of the types of work that you've done and that we've done together where we're doing similar types of things with machine learning. And then we can talk a little bit about how we integrate language models as well.
Sure, Chris. I think talking about the machine learning applications in terms of sort of, building something like a chatbot or building some sort of, prediction to predict the future costs for a project, all of those things are possible with machine learning. I think what this does is sort of take that to the next level in terms of, being able to put the predictions into the RAG, as you said, and augment it with the language model. And so that your end user doesn't have to be fluent in the predictive analytics. They can just simply ask the questions they want to ask, and the predictive analytics through the large language model are going to be able to give them something that's easily interpretable.
And so really the role that the language model plays there is interpreting the results, not having to be a data scientist to understand what the information, what the outcomes of the information are, and allow people to have conversations with it and really customize the outputs in any way that they would find useful. Now, of course, this is an example of machine learning. And Michael, I have to say, one of the biggest questions that I get all the time is what's the difference between machine learning and AI? And the way to frame up, rather than try to define AI, the way to frame up machine learning, I think maybe I'll defer to you there, because really I just tell people anytime that you have patterns in your data and you want to be able to predict something in there, that's really a good use case for machine learning. I'll let you give a more scientific answer to that, though.
Yeah, I don't think you need to do any more than that. I mean, machine learning generally is we're taking a series of inputs and we're trying to match or predict a series of outputs. We can be much more formal and mathematical. And of course, when we sit down and actually do it, we have to. But in terms of just explaining what's going on, I think that's a really good explanation that you gave, right? We are trying to take features and data and information and trying to predict some output or some set of outputs.
And so when business leaders are thinking about how they might be able to leverage ML or machine learning versus AI, which we'll just refer to modern day AI as being language model driven AI, whether or not that's appropriate, but at least that fits into this discussion. In the case of ML, they would need to have some historical data, right? You can't just say, I want to have a machine learning model that, for example, helps me more accurately predict the way that I'm estimating my orders, right? Like if I'm doing proposals all the time, and you want to be able to do it more accurately, you're going to need to have a lot of historical data on those proposals, right? Or maybe even some actuals. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think some historical data is necessary, in terms of being able to populate the machine learning model so that we can use that to generate some outcomes and some predictive analytics.
And so the key there is that we would actually train on the patterns that are being identified in the historical data, and then we would feed the same structure of that data to this model that's created if for future things that come in. Like, for example, I was talking about, coming up with good estimates. Well, if you want to be able to come up with good estimates, then let's look at your old estimates for however many years back you have that data, and then determine like what factors led to what the cost was. And if you're tracking what your actual work was, once you actually converted the estimate into a project, let's say, and if you're actually tracking all the work that went into it, you can then actually take that actuals data, how much work actually went into creating the project or fulfilling the the deliverable, and now you can actually train your model on that and use that as a good estimating tool. So really, if anybody has a ton of different data and they want to be able to do some good predictions, add some more accuracy into some of their workflows, that's a really good fit for machine learning. And when it comes to AI, the modern day AI, at least with all the language models involved, one of our philosophies when we collaborate on projects together is that we're really almost never relying on the truth that's in the language model. One of the biggest concerns that people in business have is that I don't want to ask, ChatGPT or an API to one of those models a question because I'm worried about hallucinations. Well, this whole idea of this retrieval concept that we showed you here, even though we don't have to use a plugin, we build all of our tools custom for our customers, and then we integrate them in as API endpoints into their own system for their own system to be able to connect to. In those cases, we're just using the language model to do things like give us analysis, maybe do some visualization, handle a lot of that cool environmental stuff, actually do the chat part of it, talk like a human and know who you're talking to and be able to tailor the output accordingly. But the truth itself is coming from proprietary data sources through retrieval. And in a lot of cases, the truth is also coming from outputs of machine learning models. So machine learning models can provide outputs to language model integrations, and often those two things work in unison. So while this was a fun experiment, Michael, for us to be able to show people something in the context of sports, which of course we both love sports, probably has something to do with the fact that sports is such great structured data. Like literally the rules of football have not changed since like 1920s for the most part, let's say. So there's so much data that you can work with and so much that you can model. But the real idea here is that if anybody has any interesting business solutions that they think might fit into sort of the predictive nature, they can reach out to us and we would be more than happy to talk to them about what's possible, what kind of data they would need, and what kind of outcomes that they can predict. So Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to do this recording. It was fun to not only be able to do the presentation this past weekend, but to be able to look back on our longtime collaboration for 10 plus years and look forward almost in the same manner as a machine learning model does at some of the opportunities that we'll have in the future to be able to collaborate together. So Michael, thank you so much for all of this and all the hard work that you put into this model as well.
Thanks, Chris, and always good chatting and presenting with you.
Thank you, everybody. Any questions, please contact us here at this information. We'll look forward to chatting with all of you, and any conversation that you want to have with our paper or even with the FantasyoMatic model, you can go to the links of the GPT that are provided in this video as well. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate this, and cheers.